El Departamento de Educación de los Estados Unidos debería integrar pedagogía al Common Core. Resolución analítica son todas definiciones, son contextuales, criterios y beneficios de todos. Si por el 1% ganamos, nosotros ganamos esta ronda. La observación número 1 es que el Common Core va a estar implementado para el 2015. Abajo de esto es que dividen un espacio para las escuelas de los Estados Unidos para usar teoría crítica en cada escuela. Punto 2 es que estos estudiantes de kinder al 12º pueden subir al conocimiento para la tierra. Punto de esto es que resuelven los problemas de las tierras. Entonces, nuestro plan. El Departamento de Educación de los Estados Unidos debería integrar pedagogía al Common Core. Nuestra solución es revocar la educación para individuales. Número 2 es salvar la educación para la planta más activista. Cuestión.
¿Quién lleva a cabo el plan?
Estados Unidos, el Departamento de Educación. Issues of methodology create unequal access to parliamentary debate and force assimilation to a privileged identity by internalized debate norms. My choice of linguistic diversity and variety is literally silenced in an activity that is not responsive to the structural violence of exclusion. So framework point number 1 is that normative policy debating is bad. It's not we should not be interested in critiquing the intended effects of impact stories to describe in debate sphere because it function both inside and outside their scope of intended function. They also ignore the complexity of problems in the status quo. It also leads into the negative impacts of speed politics in which we ignore people that don't actually have access to a political discussion. Point 2 is that resolution-centered debate is bad. For example, this resolution asks us to debate for addition to the Common Core, but this Common Core is bad. It shuts out the capacity for states to develop their own standards of education that are responsive to their actual populations that would be more effective. Next, that resolution always excludes the capacity to talk about the oppressive methodologies of the debate sphere. We would never be able to talk about it, so that's why debate is a unique space to get for us to argue about things we want to argue about. Point 3 on frameworks that evaluate interrogations of oppressive methodology. First, culture forms our beliefs. We perceive the version of reality that it communicates. Dominant paradigms predefine concepts that exist as unquestionable and unchallengeable. Culture is made by those empowered. By critiquing this, we're increasing the amount of critical education because we're not narrowing our focus onto like the resolution. We're also extending across and criticizing the activity we actually engage in. This increases the amount of social activism with ideologies displayed in the surroundings that we're allowed to internalize these thoughts and create real effective changes in the real world. When I point forward that access is key to fairness, when we advocate for the increasing access to this debate activity, we're increasing fairness. Point 5 is that we should validate our identity, our purpose, and our method in this, in which we choose to identify with linguistic and racially oppressed minorities in the debate activity. Our purpose is to disrupt this and create a new change in the norm, and our method is to our performance. On case 6.6, that performance clears debate space as a micro-political action that's key to changing debate norms. It increases the amount of inclusivity and says just because we're not doing the things that everyone else says we should be doing, that's still acceptable. Point 7 is the balance of physical affirmation that should support identification and interrogation of exclusionary and oppressive structures in the debate activity and supports an alternative that advocates for silenced voices. Also the thesis. Monolingualistic ideology norms are bad. It's built on the underlying logic of fearing difference. When we don't know what other people are saying, what other people are doing, we're scared and we want to because we're in power and we want to keep that power. So under this is that, for example, in 1965 there were literacy requirements in the United States for voting rights, and so white English-speaking Americans would sit there and ask questions to African Americans like, how many bubbles are on this bar of soap? And if the African American didn't know how many exact bubbles were on this bar of soap, they were excluded from their access to the access to voting because they spoke different. They spoke African American dialect. You don't even have to go that far back. This is happening in the status quo in the state of Utah. And 32 other states there are English-only policies in legislation, which means that if, for example, driver's exams in Utah at least are not offered in any other language other than English, it means that these people that are citizens and residents of the state are systematically being excluded from from the privileges that other white English-speaking Americans get. Moving on, this monolingualistic ideology strengthens the articulation between race and language, according to Dr. Samuel Ling from Stanford University in his book published in 2012 called Articulate While Black. We're saying that he says that the linguistic characteristics of articulateness is being so tied to race. For example, in Barack Obama's 2008 campaign, the #1 compliment he got was, "Oh, you're pretty articulate." A quote from Romney is, "I mean, you got the first mainstream African American who is articulate and good-looking and bright and a nice-looking guy." So this is an exceptionalizing discourse when linguistic and racial minorities are seen as like, "Oh, look, they're a special thing when they're in an academic sphere like this." This is incredibly dehumanizing. Yes, last question.
Which means what is your advocacy in Afrikaans?
Je vais le faire après, un moment s'il vous plaît. In debate, we're creating this mold of white hierarchy in which like the imposed ideal is like this white English-speaking American that can engage in this debate sphere, and this is bad because it's excluding everyone else who doesn't speak English natively or cannot engage with the theater, the type of argument that we're doing in this language. Next to linguistics terrorism, this forces other people to speak other languages to speak English, means the eradication of one's identity, means that devalidates anyone's identity and linguistic identity identity to be portrayed in this round and seen as invalid when arguments are non-responsive. Language monopoly is the instrument of leaders who desire to change society in a deliberate effort to influence and control behaviors of others. So the impacts. Impact number one is deculturalization and assimilation. You're literally stripping someone's identity and capacity to identify themselves in the round. This is incredibly harmful. You see that you're systematically excluding people that have different ways of knowing, different ways of thinking, different ways of representation from engaging in this debate activity. This creates a hierarchy of white English-speaking Americans. It's also linked to the cyclical racism in which debate is not offered in NPDA or FA in any other languages. For example, in IFA 2000, that was the last quiz, in IFA 2012, 80%, there were all the events were in English. Individual events, parliamentary rounds, nothing was offered in any other language. Which means that anyone that wanted to engage, even though this was supposed to be an international scene, were excluded from this. This is the linchpin of racism in debate and leads to exclusion that decreases the amount of diversity that we see in the round and into the debate activity, which means that we're not getting the amount of diversity and we're killing the debate activity. I already got your question, I said it was last. Alternative. Vote for our performance on case as a disruption of the internalized systematic exclusionary norms of monolingualism. Again, vote for our performance on case as a disruption of the internalized and systematic exclusionary norms of monolingualism. Solvency point number one is this. We're getting you a copy. This is disrupting monolingualism. It validates the engagement of debate activity in different ways, and it includes this difference. It changes the underlying logic from fearing difference to accepting difference, meaning that you have to now deal with whatever uncomfortability comes your way. Part of this is that it creates dissonance among monolingual ideology and avoids the mold of English, white-speaking American in debate activity, and it increases the amount of population and debaters that are allowed to engage in this activity and develop their own advocacies and develop their own argumentative skills, which is what debate activity is supposed to do. When we're systematically excluding them, it means that they don't have the access to education and to presenting their own arguments and their own advocacies in the real world that would eventually solve back for issues of race and violence that affect these minorities. Because right now, we're not giving them access to this. The ballot is an affirmation of our idea for our project. Voting for it means that you get us to more rounds, means we can affect more people, and this is the key to micro-political action through grassroots movement technology. Prefer our identity, purpose, and method in this round because we represent. What did I talk about?
All right. There's going to be one off on top. Then the solvency of the plan. No, I mean the solvency of the plan, as it was articulated in Spanish. I hope you all felt that. Okay. Then the first, their framework page, case in order.
Okay, solvency at the bottom?
No, okay, so one off on top. The plan, not the alternative, the thing that they read at the top where they said this is what we'll do and they read the resolution in Spanish. Then their framework, case in order, with the alt and their solvency on the bottom. Everybody good? See. Okay. First off is the procedural. A is the interpretation. You should evaluate the round based on content rather than performance. I repeat, you should evaluate the round based upon content, not performance. Second interpretation. Debes evaluar el constantemente en el contenido en el lugar del contenido en el lugar de la presentación. I repeat. Debes evaluar el contestamento en el contenido en el lugar de la interpretación. Via the violation, they say that we should vote on the performance and not the content, even though they do not actually read a plan in their solvency as it is predicated. That's why Kathy was confused in my overview. The C argument is the fact that the standards. The first is the affirmative becomes a moving target, allowing the affirmative to shift because because if we beat the performance, they can say that they can vote on the content. If we beat on the content, they say they can shift to the performance. That creates a moving target. The negative never literally has the ability to win. Second argument is the ground. Specifically, the affirmative speaks first and asks to punish us for a performance we haven't even met yet. They're trying to punish us for the fact that we showed up here to debate. However, they made no assumptions as to what language we would choose to speak or what that was going to be true. You can extend across all of the argumentation as to how we asked every single one of our cross-examination questions in another language reasons as to why we are collapsing the monolinguistic culture as well. The second argument is ground, which the affirmative, the little a into this is they kill solvency because it cuts off the movement. We are forced to functionally oppose something that we fundamentally agree with, reasons as to why this movement never has the ability to leave this room. Secondarily, we have been engaging, you can extend across all the arguments that Nevada has been making against this case for this entirety tournament. We've been engaging this performance every single round, to the point at which every Every other Nevada team has already done this. Reasons as to why your case is already solved. You have no argument as to why this is going to be shown, why this round is absolutely critical. Dear the voters, first is education. The point of which we're actually learning about ecological pedagogy, but rather learning about other implications of language. We argue that is always going to be key. But secondarily, we argue that our procedural is absolutely key to interrogate language. The second argument is that fairness, specifically if their argument is true about English being totalizing. We haven't even generated these links yet. Reasons as to why that is probably colonialist, and the reasons as to why they link into their criticism extremely harder because the negative hasn't even spoken yet. We argue that's probably pretty otherizing and a pretty huge form of oppression. Is a reason why you should independently reject them absent this sheet of paper. The third argument, or little a into this, is that we read the interpretation in Spanish as well as English, collapsing monolinguistics. Second, B is we ask questions in other languages, difference specifically, and now we have engaged. Oh, you want me to explain difference? Okay. The way that the interpretation is explained is that we change the E's to A's. This is Derrida's theory of difference, in which we actually destabilize the entirety of language. You can look into the copy of the interpretation that we gave you. We would prefer it if you would all pass around and see it as why we are actually destabilizing language. Where the language is the key to root cause of all oppression, not necessarily what language you speak, but rather the phonetic pronunciations are going to be at the bottom. And the reason as to why that is what is absolutely key to solve. Our interpretation will always solve better than theirs. And now we have engaged with the performance and thus can focus on the content. The fourth argument is that our purpose is to embrace the epistemology of the affirmative advocacy while engaging in meaningful discussion of the resolution. Our method is to recognize our participation in a monolithic activity, but to destabilize it with our use of language and our identity as two white privileged individuals. Is anybody that repeated?
Yes.
Yes. Our purpose is to embrace the epistemology of the affirmative advocacy while engaging in meaningful discussion of the resolution, and our method is to recognize our participation in a monolithic activity, but to destabilize it with our use of language, and our identity is that of two white privileged individuals. Cool. Moving into the solvency debate. Your solvency claims that absolutely never solves the point which creates an ecological crisis. We argue the term that it's functionally rooted in social as well as ecological crisis and is key to creating an ecological catastrophe. Richard Kahn, specifically the first book that was ever written on ecological catastrophe, said that all of the motivations must come from claims of catastrophe because however, these don't actually solve because they create and alienate the individual as well as preventing them from actually taking action, as well as resulting in fascism, from which individuals literally feel as though they have no individual agency in regards to the federal government, but rather only what the government tells them to believe in. The second argument is Carlos Davidson, the professor of UC Davis, on catastrophism, specifically stated that ecological pedagogy does not lead to motivation. First, that it leads to blaming of the individual as the reason as to why they have no individual agency, is how they are somehow the problem. But secondarily, it becomes the boy who cried wolf policy, the one which only individuals will act in the short term. However, once they realize the actual problems are not as harmful as they have been told, it will stop acting in the long term. Reasons why the movement is entirely abandoned and collapses on its face. The third argument is that Davidson also said that ecological pedagogy exists from directs itself from real solutions by blaming the poor as well as the third world countries for these environmental problems. This is at the root cause of all ecological pedagogy. Reasons to why we believe you should reject it. The fourth argument is that the founding of ecological pedagogy is based upon racism. You can target it extend across Elric's population bombs. He was one of the founding fathers of the ecological pedagogy, and reasons why forced sterilization should be enforced on that movement. Second argument is that this is literally the Malthusian ethic, which justifies the killing of massive individuals, and specifically we blame the continent of Africa for all of our population problems. Reason as to why we should justify the entirety of their oppression as well as killing the systematic killing of all of those individuals. We argue that their plain text links them into the entirety of this. Moreover, that impacts up to social justice. It's going to impact out much stronger than any of the other implications that they could have claimed from in the room. Anything else, Kelly? Framework. We argue that our alternative, our purpose identity method, engages in theirs just as much as they do. We argue that we have the ability to solve. Not only that, because we spoke second and we engaged in the entirety of the performance, we argue you should prefer the negative team in this instance, the point which we are going to have the ability to solve better than they are. Solvency. Sorry, this is actually on the impacts page. They say that and it specifically in the NFALG arguments, is that their argument is that, that the NFA competition, that language debate is not offered in other languages. We argue that there are multiple other forums which check this back, like the IDEA, specifically the International Debate Education Association, that specifically hosts the World's Tournament every year. And just because they didn't provide other languages in Italy doesn't mean they didn't the year before, as well as years before in China, to the point in which in China specifically they allowed for individuals to speak in other languages, as well as providing individuals from two different teams to speak in entirely different languages. They provided interpreters and translators for both teams, reasons as to why they did increase overall education, reasons why there are alternative formats of debate which you could choose to participate in. We understand that you do not choose to participate in those, and we are absolutely fine with that. However, our argument is that other forums do exist in which you are not excluded. We argue that they provide no analysis why this unique forum is going to be key to solving for the entirety of their movement when other movements do simply exist. The second argument is the rule 4.42 specifically in the World Championship highlights this. The judges are not allowed to discriminate on different competitors based upon their use of language, as all individual judges are actually have the communication, and any individual judge who does not speak the native language is also communicated this argument. Their argument argumentation in a different language so that they can understand their arguments. The rule point 4.43 also follows this rule and actually justifies it at all tournaments in which the World Association tournament is actually functionally hosted. You can also extend across the fact that there are individual debaters from Afghanistan debating at this tournament. When those individuals come from Afghanistan, they may choose to utilize English, but no one ever told them that they had to do that. They choose to do that. We argue that's the reason why that solves for the entirety of the solution that they are trying to claim. Secondarily, we are simply winning on empirics as to why the debate activity actually is becoming more inclusive. First is going to be China. There are multiple divisions. Second is going to be the interpreters and translators. And third, Italy is not indicative of the overall price of the overall abilities that happen via the plan. And do you want me to read? Did you ever hear disabilities? And we argue that debate is becoming more inclusive for individuals who do speak English and have disabilities, specifically hearing as well as visionary. We argue that there are plenty of individuals who have speaking as well as auditory disabilities. Specifically, in the community college in Northern California, has a debater who debates it entirely in sign language. He informs everyone pre-round and only asks for an individual to explain for an interpreter. The second argument is that in Diablo Valley in 2010, they specifically had an individual who was blind. All that he asked for was verbal time signals and a braille reader. The second argument is you can send across Joe Orozco from the Texas State, specifically who's a debater who is blind and chooses to continue to participate in this activity. All he asks for is verbal hand signals and a braille transcriber. The third argument is that Nick Matthews specifically has a hearing impairment. However, we argue that the activity has become more inclusive to him. We argue that they have no ability to solve. On the rule of the valid arguments, there is absolutely no reason that this round is absolutely key or why this activity is key. We argue that Somerset is videotaping this round and has no problem putting it online. Reasons to why, even if your movement fails, there's no reasons why this movement cannot continue on the internet. We argue the internet is a much better mechanism by which to solve for the entirety of this movement because people can actually learn about this round as opposed to having to be debating it. We argue that the actual act of arguing against it would actually turn individuals against the movement rather than being allowed to watch someone else argue against it increases the overall understanding and education.
Nuestro caso, nuestro framework, como dicen ustedes, los impactos, nuestro alternativo y resolución.
Repeat that, por favor.
T, nuestro caso, nuestro framework, los impactos, alternativo y resolución. Resolución, translated. Resolution means solutions, solvency. Si me hace que en unos cuantos años lo sigo, la raza se levantará, lengua intacta, cargando de lo mejor de los todos de las culturas. Esa brigura domina, la rebeldia saltará como cuero viejo fuera la estabilidad. El debe obedecer, decaer y aceptar. Ya verás. It is translated by Miss Andalzua. Yes, in a few years or centuries, la raza will rise up, tongue intact, carrying the best of all the cultures that sleeping serpent. Rebellion, revolution will spring up, like old skin will fall to slave ways of obedience, acceptance, and silence. You'll see. What we're arguing specifically that our performance is enabling us to be able to engage in other things, to be able to embrace multitude of identities and experiences within the debate community. Yes, they may be excluded within this round because we don't essentially be able to include them by translating a lot of things that we use. However, their exclusion is minuscule compared to the many individuals who can't even participate in this debate. Even if you want to buy any of their examples that they provide you within the debate round, it won't even matter because you're going to see why a lot of them are false. Going on to the topicality. My first argument on topicality is another really to the criticism because the topicality is a representation of current debate norms, meaning that we have to engage in a certain particular way. That means that they're uncomfortable able to go against their own scope of practice, meaning they're unable to be able to embrace other identities and other approaches to debate, meaning that we can't be able to engage in other languages, including Spanish or Italian, French, or any other language from that. That means that they're refusing to allow for diverse linguistics by not actually engaging. On to the specific topicality proper. First of all, our evaluation is not part of the purpose. However, this is the problem that we're trying to interrogate specifically with performance. It should be related within the context, meaning that a lot of the performance that we provided in case shows that the content was completely excluded. However, you still want to be able to analyze that performance rather. Either way, going to the standard saying that we essentially become a movie chart because we're only engaging in performance so we can be however, this is not unique specifically because the moment that we actually allow them to be able to engage in the case, that allows them to see that they still have ground in this instance. Secondly, onto the ground standard specifically, where they see that it actually cuts movements because we're not able to engage with other individuals. However, we're actually creating discourse because it forced them to be uncomfortable. It forced all you have to be uncomfortable. This means that this tournament is actually talking about this more, so that means we created a discourse within the tournament, not just within the round. So therefore, they're able to gain more ground because they came into this round knowing that they were going to speak Spanish and other languages. Onto the borders, this is the key education. First of all, they're going to decrease education specifically with the topicality for those within this round, but either way, countersign specifically, we're actually increasing critical education much better than regular education, specifically on the policy debate level, because you weren't able to know as much as we want to be able to bring within the table about monolingualism and how it's bad essentially within the debate round. Also, the argument saying that this is essentially colonialist, however, they're essentially excluding it because they're misleading us specifically by using the topicality, meaning you can't look at the criticism unless you look at the topicality first. This shows why they're actually still linking into the criticism. On to their argument about the difference. You can't. What was the argument? Onto the argument with this process that we can't change the E's and A's. However, the moment we're actually able to look at one thing, we're still be able to create a relationship on one object. Even though we're not looking at the same thing, that shows that we still have a visual relationship. Even if you want to include those individuals that are visually impaired, they're able still be able to identify by feeling the object. So therefore, we're more inclusive than they are. Going into their argument to the case background or context or whatever it is. Our case is our performance. Our advocacy is the criticism. So the moment that they actually only engage in case first, and they're actually trying to go for it, goes completely wrong specific, because you need to be able to engage in the criticism first before you look into the actual case. The case is our performance. Either way, any attack on the case is a straw man, because that means it actually turns their ideological and epistemological shift, because they are misrepresenting our argument by actually engaging in case and not looking at performance or the criticism. The moment that they exclude the criticism, the performance, they put that second, means that they relink to the criticism. Going to the framework. First, extend across all of our first, second, third, fourth point, specifically the normative debate policy is not essentially good and impactful, because we're not able to we're actually decreasing the education, because we can't even discuss other things that actually exclude more individuals. Secondly, our the resolution debate is bad essentially because it cuts out other standards of education. You want to look at the analysis even with the common case if you want, specifically that it actually shuts out other individuals, because it's all the test that they provide within the common cause is specifically only in English, meaning they still exclude Spanish speakers and other individuals who speak, for example, Chinese, Mandarin, even dialects. Three, you want to send across we want to be able to validate interrogations. Second one, even if you want to buy any of the performance, we evaluate interrogations, we interrogate you more than they do. Therefore, we outweigh much more magnitude and time frame. Secondly, on extend across our fourth is access to key to fairness. This is an important part. I'll get to the very end of the framework. This is important because access to key to fairness, specifically not for the individuals that are within this debate tournament, specifically us four specifically, but those individuals who are politically excluded and can't even participate in this debate round. Fifth point, which is identity purpose method.
Question?
I'll get to the end of the framework, I told you. Going to the framework specifically, you want to extend across our identity that we're actually representing the racial and minorities. The moment that they say that they want to be able to represent the white privilege, that means that's re-entrenching white privilege and therefore resegregating individuals who can't even participate. That means that we're able to include more diverse individuals to be more inclusive in the debate than they are. So therefore, they can't even gain some sort of solvency within the framework. They can't gain. That means they can't get any access within the solvency of the alternative. Yeah.
How exactly are you interrogating us before we speak?
The moment, Bell Hooks argues that the moment we make you uncomfortable tells us that means we're evaluating our negative biases, which means we're interrogating our inner selves. Meaning, even though we may be saying, thank you very much, but in the end, we're really analyzing whether or not we really mean that for that matter. That is that interrogation. The moment you become uncomfortable, it shows that we're interrogating you and it's actually working. Going to, yeah. I can only take one question at a time, I'm sorry. Oh, I extend across the fourth point of the role of BAT. You want to be able to see the role of BAT is actually a key affirmation of the movement, specifically by being more inclusive of other diverse languages. Going to the impacts. I'll get to the end of the impacts if you want. Extend across our deculturalization, they provide no analysis whatsoever how this doesn't happen by not being able to engage and embrace other ideology, other languages whatsoever. That means actually they're able to force us to strip away the moment that I specifically identify myself as Spanish speaking. However, I'm forced to be able to assimilate to only participate. This is something that is not a choice, even though it's a structural matter. Specifically, the society is able to implement this on me. Either way, there are analysis within the IFA argument. However, there are multiple other communities, for example, that actually allow, for example, hard of hearing. However, the Hearing Impaired Debate Society was actually established by Mankato State University and Highland Community College that created all individuals to participate by using translator, computers to type, flows, and braille. However, 1994 NFALD did not recognize their winning, so therefore they were actually completely shut down, and NFA said that they couldn't even participate after that. That means that they were forced to go back into NFALD, even though the braille computers were not even provided for any of those who were hard of hearing, including slowing down for those individuals who had lip, clap, palate, lisp, or even some sort of speech impairment such as dyslexia and apraxia. Going to their argument on, I think it was their Afghanistan argument. However, they completely misunderstand it. Specifically, the person who is in Afghanistan is teaching debate for Afghani individuals in English. Look, this analysis shows that they're still be able to recreate and use English as a dominant language, which means they don't actually engage in multilingualism and multiculturalism. That shows that they're reinterpreting monolingualism as a whole, even with the example that they provided. Second of all, their argument saying that the Rule 4.4 judge that actually allows for other individuals, what was that? Oh, to allow individuals to participate.
Yeah, 4.42 is like not allowed to discriminate against language.
Oh, not allowed to discriminate against language. However, you can see that happening. We're arguing specifically, it may not be with this whole term, but we're actually constructing, arguing a lot of the whole debate community specifically. We saw this happening, unfortunately, within high school as well. For example, John Michael Smith, who was from Roy High School, broke into this top 16 individual events in NFA Nationals in 2010, but unfortunately, the judge actually stopped him because he had a list, because she did not understand him. That means he was forced to sit down and not participate in the top 16. That means he was unable to be able to compete. We're challenging all of the debate and ideology. Also, you want to extend across cyclical poverty, they provide no analysis as to why we don't actually gain sort of impact on the cyclical poverty. Also, the argument, we actually include individuals specifically who have speech impairment and hearing impairment, because that means they're able to engage in other languages. The Mormon, for example, dyslexia, they process language different, meaning they reverse from CAT, it's ACT rather than CAT, meaning that is a new language. We're more inclusive of those individuals who are actually visually and hard of hearing and actually speech impaired. Extend across alternative, they provide no options whatsoever. You have to be able to look at the alternative first, that you have to vote for our performance on the case as shown to be able to disrupt monolingual ideologies.
Okay. Same order. Which is going to be, it's not really a T, it's more like a procedural, just to clarify. Then the plan solvency.
All solvency or plan solvency?
The plan solvency, like the Spanish part of the debate, yes. And then their framework, thesis, impacts.
Yep. Take it. You're going to take it.
Okay, I'm gonna start the timer then, chat to Jonathan for a second.
Okay.
Tell me where you want it. Tell me where you want it. On the procedural argument, they say that the performance is to embrace the multitudes in debate. We would argue that we have always engaged in this at the point at which we engage you in Spanish, but additionally we engage in difference as well as Afrikaans, as well as Spanish as well as English. We are embracing more multitudes than they are within this debate. When we ask questions in point of orders that are in other languages as them, they say that our oppression is minuscule compared to theirs. That's fine. We're not arguing that. We say that there's probably oppression in debate, but we are engaging within this too. You're not going to punish us because we spoke second. On the T proper, well, it's not really a T. They say that T is representative of debate norms. With it, look, first off, this is not a topicality, which is probably the reason why it's not representative of debate norms. But second of all, we say that this is a key to breaking down debate norms because it allows us to engage in your advocacy, in which we read the interpretations in a different language, but also we read it in we switch around the vowels in the English interpretation, which means that we're the key to breaking down English better than they are because they engage in normative English, whereas we're the only ones that are breaking down normative English because we switch around the vowels. If you look to that interpretation that we passed around, additionally, they say we need because their content was what do we need?
You have my phone. You should evaluate the performance in the context, but they don't ever discuss the context first and English second at all. They just say.
They say you should discuss the performance within the content, but first of all, they don't even discuss the context, or they don't even discuss the context on the actual Spanish part of the debate. Additionally, onto the standards, they say moving target. They say that a moving target is non-unique because this would happen anyway. Look, our argument here is that they are a moving target because either it allows the app to shift, because if we beat them on the performance, they will say vote on the content, the Spanish part of their performance. But if we beat them in the content, they will say shift to performance, which is what is happening when you see that they don't answer any of our arguments about how eco-pedagogy specifically is bad, that they're saying just vote on the performance, which is fine because we've already engaged them in the performance. It's not a reason to prefer the affirmative team because they spoke first. That's the argument on the sheet of paper, is you're not going to punish us for speaking second because we do engage in their argument. The second standard is out of ground because you would be punishing us for not speaking first. They say that they create discourse by making you uncomfortable. Agreed, you created discourse, congratulations, but we should be allowed to engage in that discourse as well. And there's no reason why you would not preference our type of discourse, especially when we're engaging in breaking down English too. Additionally, on the education, they say that on the voter of education, they say that they increase critical education. We agree. We think that we do that more as well because we're also inserting the ideas of Derrida and disrupting the English language. Additionally, they say that we exclude them with the topicality, but first off, we don't make this issue an a priori issue. We just say that you would evaluate our types of breaking down of English first, which means that you don't necessarily have to evaluate this sheet of paper over their criticism. We just say that we're going to engage in their criticism better. Additionally, they say on fairness, extend across our fairness standard, which means that you're not going to evaluate their criticism before ours necessarily. Additionally, we say that we have engaged in multiple ways. We ask in Spanish, we ask in different languages, and also Derrida. They say that they're creating the relationship. I don't think anyone understands what this argument means, but we say that we create the relationships between language better because we do more. Additionally, extend across our purpose methodology and our identity. This is going to become an issue on the critique, but they don't answer it here. Yeah.
Make sure to disclaim that we do not claim to represent all individuals of any given culture. We represent us.
Right.
That is it.
On the purpose identity methodology, we don't necessarily claim to represent all individuals of white color, for example. That's the argument that they're making specifically on the critique. Jonathan and I just represent Jonathan and I. We're not saying that we know what the white individuals in this room are thinking or how they want to be represented. We don't claim to do that.
Also, secondarily, saying you trying to represent yourselves in an entirety of a subsect is probably oppressive to that individual.
I don't want that.
Please.
Okay. Also, them trying to represent themselves as an entirety of one identity is probably a bad thing because that means that they're speaking for others and they don't know if others want to engage in English or if they want to engage in Spanish, which is going to be worse because they might be oppressing people who want to engage in English debate. On to the plan proper. They say that we must engage the criticism first. That's fine. We totally do that when we break down the other forms of debate. They say that excluding the performance is a link to the criticism. We do not exclude your performance at all. We just decide that we want to talk about eco-pedagogy as well, which is probably a reason why you're going to be preferring the -15 because we engage both the content and the performance within this debate. They sent across all of Jonathan's analysis about why eco-pedagogy is bad. He talks about how claims of catastrophe lead to no agency and fascism. He also talks about how eco-pedagogy leads to the blaming of the individual. And also how eco-pedagogy's founding was racist. He talks about Elric and the population bomb as well as the Malthusian ethics that go into more. They straight drop those. We engage in content and performance, which is why you prefer the -15. Framework? I got that. Very good. They say the normative policy is bad. We agree with that. That's probably why we didn't argue the normative policy debating is bad. We say that we should be able to engage in different languages, and we say that we do that better than you guys do, which is a problem for you because that means that we're going to be preferring the -15 here. Additionally, they say that they interrogate more than we do, but they don't ever tell you how this happens. At the point at which we're interrogating in way more languages than them, as well as breaking down the English language, you would be preferring our interrogation. We say that we're making them uncomfortable too, which is probably a reason why we solve back for them as well. Like, they just have the ability to solve for us, but that's not going to be preferable in a world in which we're both uncomfortable and they're uncomfortable as well. Additionally, their next argument is on our identity, purpose, and method, where they say that we re-entrench white privilege. Again, we don't claim to represent all individuals who come from white privilege. We just say that that is our stance on this debate, which means that we recognize that we need to engage in this debate in order to break down those normative policies that we would otherwise be engaging in. Yeah?
They say fairness should be evaluated because of the exclusion of others. They don't solve for that inclusion. Secondarily, we solve better.
They say fairness should be evaluated for the exclusion of others. First off, they don't solve for that inclusion, and second off, we solve for that better. Additionally, they say that the ballot is key to movement, but they're ignoring all of Jonathan's analysis about how this round is being filmed, and if it is truly key to the movement, then we will post it online and we will allow your movement to continue, but they're not making any arguments as to why your ballots in this round particularly are key, why they need to beat us in order to do that. But additionally, we say that we entrench their movement better because we're engaging in other forms of debate.
Also, forcing it to be this round, it makes us into enemies instead of
also forcing it to be this round is going to make us enemies of their movement, which is why you would prefer us. Impacts? Their first argument is that culture stripping still happens, but they're ignoring all of Jonathan's analysis about forms of debate that allow people to participate in other languages. For example, the IDEA, which spells out idea, where they talk about how they provide other languages and they provide interpreters as well as they provide interpreters, which means that culture stripping doesn't happen because these people are allowed to preserve their languages while still engaging in debate. They say that people are forced to speak in English, but that's not true in a world in which there are other debate forums. Sure, they might be criticizing the idea of parley, but at the point at which no one in this round was forced to speak any type of English, it's probably a reason why no one is actually forced to speak English. That's just a construction that you guys talk about. Additionally, they say debate gets shut down for those with disabilities, but they're ignoring all of our analysis about the 4 individual debaters who are actually able to do this. Additionally, they say, what?
This isn't high school and this isn't NFALD.
Okay. Additionally, this isn't high school and this isn't NFALD. There are other forms in which people can participate. We say that culture stripping does not happen. Additionally, we say that we solve for them all better because we engage in more types of language.
procedural-based argument on top. The impacts debate. The case solvency debate, so the plan, ecological pedagogy arguments. Then the alt and alt solvency. Is everyone ready? Yep, there will be an overview. It would be awesome if you all would it on the ballot. That was a joke.
Just wherever you want.
Is everybody ready? I think there are a couple of reasons you're voting negative in today's debate round. The first of them is the procedural-based argument, one in which Kelly and I absolutely engage the entirety of their argument. You can extend across our identity, purpose, and method. Reason as to why they should not be. There are also theoretical objections to them being able to read two advocacies. The same thing as bringing two different affirmative plans and being able to go for one or the other in each of their different frameworks. We argue that that is uniquely abusive, and reason as to why you should vote there. But secondarily, even if you don't want to vote there, you vote for our advocacy, which is at the bottom, which engages in the entirety of their arguments, as well as our POIs, because we solve better. We're using multiple different languages, not just Spanish and English. We're embracing African languages as well. We argue that that is always going to be key. But secondarily, we are winning on both levels of the debate because you are not going to solve in your mechanism of solvency under your framework if you want to evaluate the advocacy, or you're not going to solve if you want to evaluate the plan because your plan is probably a bad idea because you're straight conceding solvency arguments. Also, they proceed to the procedural is key to us engaging them. You can't just reject us for trying to provide for the ability for us to engage that. There's not a unique warrant as to why that is going to be true. On the procedural level, there we meet is absolutely nonsensical and does not meet the entirety of our interpretation. They say context is key, however, we argue that you to the point you don't even evaluate context. There's no reason why that's true. Secondarily, we want you to extend across our original interpretation reasons to why they absolutely do this, right? We say that you should evaluate the round on content rather than performance. They are trying to go for all of their arguments are based upon our performance, our performance, our performance. That's all they are going to say in the PMR. All of that is reasons to why it is uniquely abusive on this procedural. Secondarily, I want you to extend across all the solvency-based, all of the standards, the moving target, the ground, as well as the individual voters specifically. Now, on the performance, how we've actually engaged. These are functionally solvency-based arguments that are put on a procedural in order to trick you, and you all fall for it pretty hard. The reason as to why they never actually answer any of these arguments is because they think they're part of the voters, however, they're absolutely not. We destabilize the entirety of language in English and Spanish because we utilize multiple different languages. We entirely indict the concept of monolinguistics as well as utilizing that in order to solve back. Secondarily, we indict English by utilizing the concept of difference. They straight concede Derrida. Her answer is nonsensical. Don't allow any new articulation of that answer. There's no reason as to why they destabilize it. We provided you all written text as to why that is true. In order to destabilize language, you are voting negative in today's debate round. Also extend across our identity, purpose, and methods why it's not homogenizing, probably doesn't cause racism against other individuals, and we are utilizing our identity as two individuals in order to break down monolinguistics, not the identity of a larger group of people. We argue that that is speaking for others and turns back the entirety of the problem that they are trying to create. On the impact base, your arguments are just straight up not true. First, this isn't high school, you don't solve in high school. Second, this isn't NFALD, and you wouldn't solve an NFALD if we were there either. You provide no specific analysis to why parley is key. However, we provide you alternate worlds in which alternate forms of debate which you all could go and choose to participate in if you would like to run these arguments. We argue that these absolutely exist, and those are indicative, right? Send across the China example. Send across how they have specific rules in their guidelines that will require accommodation. Secondarily, send across the example of this round, considering it's all you all have. There's no rule that says we all had to speak English or we all couldn't speak Afrikaans. There's no reason as to why that's not true. There's no reason why it's going to be true. But secondarily, the argument that they drop is damning for them. That right there is a video camera. This round can go online. When that is true, individuals can watch this round, observe the information, contemplate their own relation to it without being forced to become an enemy to it. We argue that is absolutely key to solvency. This is a straight dropped argument. It's a straight up solvency turn. Reasons why they never have the ability to solve. Solvency debate. You straight concede all of my reasons why ecological pedagogy is a terrible idea. That's the reasons why they lose the substantive debate. However, they're not going to go for that. All of these arguments is wasted speech time. The reasons why you vote on the procedural, as the reasons why we still have to defend both aspects in the original LLC. But secondarily, you can vote here because they don't solve for their performance. Vote on their plan text because it's absolutely a terrible idea and it results in racism. All solvency. Cross-apply all of the arguments that I've already made, as well as how this is a video online, which will have the ability to solve 100% of their argumentation, as well as our identity, purpose, and method solves back 100% better than they do because we engage it. Secondarily, we engage it in other languages as well, like Afrikaans as well as Spanish language, and break down English because of Derrida's use of difference. We argue this is absolutely key, specifically, and that is the only way that you as the judges to evaluate today's debate round in the voting of the litigation today. Thank you.
Todos listos?
See?
Look, judges, don't let them confuse you in this round. We're going to show you, we're going to clear things up during this speech. First off, on their procedural, I'm not really sure what they're trying to do with this procedural when in one speech they stand up and tell you that this is supposed to just give them access to like our equal impact in this round, and the next time they tell you that this should, then they tell you that this should be a voting issue and evaluate this procedural, but then they tell you that no, this just means that their member speech says that this just means that we both get access to these things, that we should talk about both of them. Look, underlinedly, they have a couple of bad arguments on this page that I'm going to respond to. First, they tell us that that our performance is this issue about performance and content. First of all, Barbara said content, not context. When we tell you that our performance is our content, that the Spanish in our performance is the content to introduce multilingualism and disrupt monolingualism in this weird fiat parliamentary world where we're supposed to engage, that is our performance. Let's clear that up. When we engage on case through our performance.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Kathy's face here. I think this is a new re-articulation of the we meet and is entirely new.
In my speech, I said we need that we evaluate the content, not performance, but it should be integrated as both.
I'm sure it's okay. I'm sorry to sing
I want to be part of it. Include me.
Look, that's the number one thing that came out of our speech. In our alternative, it says vote for our performance on case. It didn't say anything else. That's what we're doing. Our performance on case is supposed to create this disruption in a world where we're asking you to validate, extend across our solvency, where we say, you're validating this multilingualism by voting on case. That's what our alt solvency does. When you, in this imaginary world, when you vote for a case that is presented in another language, that's where the true solvency comes from. We're not advocating for any case or solvency, we're advocating for the performance of case, for performing in a different language. But moving on with this, they tell you that we shouldn't punish them, that you shouldn't punish them for this. We're not. They tell you that they're trying to break down English better than we do. We're not breaking down English. We're breaking down monolingualism. It's not about breaking down the English language, because it can just as easily be monopolized by Spanish language or any other language. We're disrupting monolingualism with the underlying logic of fearing difference. This is something that's completely conceded, and they're not understanding what our performance is all about. Look. They can interrogate English as much as they want. We're interrogating monolingualistic ideology, and that's the basis of this round. And we saw better for that through our performance. But moving on, we never accused them of saying that they represent all of the whites. But this is a point that's going to come across on different pages. Look, when we need to evaluate identity and purpose method, which is what our framework says, their identity says we're representing white, like we're representing ourselves as like white privileged individuals. Prefer our identity when we tell you we're inclusive of the linguistic and racial minorities that aren't presented in this round.
We did not tell you to prefer our identity. I think that's a misrepresentation of our argument.
I'll rephrase.
Thank you.
Okay. When they tell you that their identity is white privilege, it's individuals of white privilege, I'm telling you prefer our identity when we include all of these linguistic and racial minorities that are systematically excluded from this debate round. They say speaking for others is bad when we tell them that speaking for others is the only thing that we can do when they're excluded from this round, from this debate activity, this structural oppression. This is the only thing that we can do, which is why you're going to prefer our identity to our purpose and our method. When we are committed to this 100%, they try to say that we're shifting out of or we can shift out of case and critique and vote for whichever one they undercover. But look, we have been talking about our performance and our critique every single speech. This is proof that we have been unconditional to our alternative insolvency. But moving on to our impacts. Flow across our deculturalization and assimilation. They didn't give you any analysis before our warranted analysis about Navajo boarding schools, before our analysis about the voting requirements and about monolingualism today, as well as this hierarchy that's being created. This goes completely dropped in the bounds of the white hierarchy that's being molded from the debate norms. We move on to our alternative and our solvency. Our alternative stands. They make absolutely zero arguments when we tell you to vote for our performance on case as a disruption of the systematic exclusionary norms of monolingualism. Look, their only argument here is that this ballot isn't key. This is all defense. When we tell you that, it's our warrant that when this ballot creates motions in this room, and it creates it is a micro-political action to create a grassroots movement that leads to change, this goes completely dropped. This is where you see our real solvency next, is our solvency of identity, purpose, and method. Even if they want to try and do this, even if they want to try and engage in this multilingualistic advocacy, they're not doing as good a job as we are, because when we tell you that we're including all these other minorities, all these voices that are systematically shut out, that can't have access to this round, we're having the better identity, purpose, and method and solvency in this round, when we actually understand what the on-case Spanish performance meant, and what it symbolized, and what it represented. But moving on to our framework, look, too much goes dropped in this framework. They try to come up in the MG and make arguments about fairness after it was completely dropped in the first speech. But look, Extend across all our reasons why normative debating policy is bad. They try to engage in our critique and in the policy round by saying, look, vote for case, vote for this, look, we want to engage in this. Look, by not engaging in our critique or in our performance, they're silencing the ability for us to interrogate these methodologies, which is why we are the only ones that interrogate these best. Also, they dropped too much on our, how you need to evaluate interrogations of oppressive methodology first. They don't make any arguments to this. When we say that's the key issue here, you're going to flow across us. Also, on our point 7, our ballads of physical affirmation, they don't say anything about this, which only increases our amount of solvency. When we're the only ones in the round that understand what's happening, and we tell you that we're including more people, vote for us.